Everybody okay with your paperwork? Is everybody ready? Okay. Thanks for coming this afternoon. We're here to provide an update on APD's reform effort over the past decade. As you know, this reform effort has been guided by an agreement between the City of Albuquerque and the U.S. Department of Justice, what we call as the CASA, or the Court-Approved Settlement Agreement. Earlier this week, the independent monitoring team overseeing the CASA determined that APD is perhaps surpassed the most important milestone, reaching 100% compliance. We want to describe how we got here, where we're at, and where we're going from here. So with that, I want to introduce Mayor Tim Keller and Chief Harold Medina to kind of go over their perspective on this, and then I'll be going over a number of slides. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Gilbert. And as Gilbert mentioned, we're going to have sort of some opening remarks, and we're going to walk through how we got to this point, both from the city's perspective and in some cases our own personal perspective. And, you know, for us, we know one thing, that we have reached a pivotal milestone for the community that is nearly a decade in the making. That's what this represents. And the Albuquerque Police Department is now in full and effective compliance with the court-approved settlement, or CASA. Now, there's many aspects to this, but first and foremost, we want to acknowledge this does warrant an absolute congratulations to our officers in our department. We know that the road to get here has not been easy. We also know that we never gave up. And as you'll see on this path, there were many points where we could have, or things were going the wrong direction. But we didn't. We kept fighting for two things. We kept fighting for supporting our law enforcement and maintaining the highest standards of accountability. And we said we have to do both. We cannot sacrifice one for the other. And in fact, we have not. So I'm also grateful to Chief Medina and his leadership and his commitment to get this department where it is today. You're going to hear about some specific actions that he took as chief to really make this happen. I'm also thankful for our police officers. They put their life on the line, of course, each and every day for our families, despite our department having to go through this, and despite having to literally retrain in terms of how to use of force for the right reasons. But for them to be able to do both of those at the same time, I know was no small task. I'm also grateful for our community that did not lose faith in this process. I know there were times when people were very optimistic, there were times when people were pessimistic, and even still, there are people who believe that this does not matter. And I will tell you that when you layer in a monitor, you layer in the Department of Justice, you layer in our city council, everyone who works in law enforcement, there is no question that this is real. There's also no question that the work continues and that we have more to do. But there is no other way to demonstrate progress than what we are sharing with you today. And so I think it is something our city should be grateful for and our city should be proud of. These have been tough times, we acknowledge that. But part of that means understanding resilience means not only dealing with tough times, but coming out of it stronger. And that is exactly what the DOJ process is literally verifying with these findings. So today we recognize how far APD has come, and it also is a recognition of hope for the future of our city and our department. So with more on this, Chief Medina.
You know, first and foremost, I want to thank each and every one of the employees of the Albuquerque Police Department, both sworn and professional staff, who brought us to this point of being in compliance. This was a team effort. We had individuals who were out in the field doing a great job. We know the success we've had in lowering property crime since 2018 when Mayor took office. I returned as a deputy chief over field all the way till now, where we're starting to see reductions in homicides. And I think that was the key, that was the vision for me and Mayor, is to have a police department that was fully effective and able to protect and improve a community's safety, but at the same time do it in a constitutional manner that honored the citizens and showed respect towards the citizens of Albuquerque. I also want to thank the families of all our employees. A lot of times when you implement reform and you implement changes of strict accountability, it does lead to a stress in an individual's life, which sometimes carry back home. And unfortunately, we did have a number of officers over the course of these many years that resigned from the department because of the scrutiny that they were under. I want to thank those that stayed here, but I want to thank the families back home who are a support network for their loved ones who served in the police department and kept them coming to work each and every day, and continued that path of reform with the Albuquerque Police Department. I also want to thank Mayor Keller. He didn't know I was going to do this part, but the honest truth is in 2020, he needed to make a decision who was going to be the next chief, and there's a national search, and he appointed me to be chief, and I hope that we did everything we needed to do to prove that going internally at the time was the best decision, because we knew what the problems were and what needed to be corrected. So, and lastly, all my deputy chiefs, whether it's Superintendent of Police Reform Eric Garcia, who I've worked with for over 20 years, or somebody new to the department, Deputy Chief Smathers, and all the others who worked with us day in and day out to provide the guidance and the accountability. Sometimes the tough decisions at the top aren't the most popular, and sometimes you don't win a popularity contest at the end, but we had people who did amazing work of accountability that led us to this place of success. Like Mayor stated in 2020, when we had the discussions of how we wanted this to go forward, we had a clear vision. We wanted to do this in a way that was good for Albuquerque, good for the citizens of Albuquerque, and we realized that we may not be able to take a template that worked in New Jersey and make it work in the city of Albuquerque in the same way. We pushed back when we had to push back, but we developed policies that I truly feel are sustainable and that will outlast the Department of Justice visit to the city of Albuquerque, and has truly worked to change the culture of Albuquerque and can remain here with future administrations as they look and are able to ensure that they're still effective with the job that they're doing to protect the community, but at the same time following what we've established as a police department. In closing, I want to thank the citizens of Albuquerque for their continued support, like Mayor said, and everybody who each and every day gives that important pat on the back to our officers, or shows their appreciation to our officers in the community. At the end of the day, our officers are out there each and every day working for the citizens of Albuquerque, and it sure goes a long way for them to see that appreciation from individuals that you sometimes don't get anymore in 2024. So thank you, and with that, we'll go back to Gilbert.
So I'll go over these slides, hopefully pretty quickly. The mayor and the chief, and we have our city attorney here, might weigh in here and there and give their perspective. Let's see. Okay. So this first slide is just a couple of quotes. If you recall back, we're going to go through a timeline of all this, but back in April 10th, 2014, this is when the DOJ released their investigative findings. Some of you were here at the time, some of you weren't, but it was pretty damning, a lot of the stuff, that we were dealing with people who posed a threat only to themselves. By we, I mean officers. Officers often used excessive force, including deadly force. There was insufficient oversight, inadequate training, and ineffective policies. And there was a culture of indifference to constitutional policing. So that was pretty widely publicized, and that's what started things off here. Happy to report that these are some other quotes that came in recent monitoring reports. So the independent monitor produces these reports. They've produced 19 of them. As you can see, they talk about us not missing a beat, that our investigators completed cases within times required by the collective bargaining agreement. They talked about, in this recent one, APD ingenuity. APD implemented policy training and practice changes that resulted in a 10% increase in operational compliance, and then finally we're at 100% compliance. So a lot of different praise there. In between all of that, there were positive, negative, and as the mayor and the chief said, we took some backslides and we overcame those challenges and have made a lot of progress.
Who's that guy?
Okay. So this is the timeline of the IMRs. If you go back from IMR 1 all the way through, there's not an IMR 7, that's the only one that was missing. This is the operational compliance. So as you can see, in the first years, they were dealing mostly with policy and secondary compliance, and then you'll see around IMR 11, kind of 8 through 12 or so is a little stagnant, and the 60s dropped down, but then really started to take off. So these last 5 IMRs, which is probably the last 2.5 years, there was just a huge increase in productivity and progress made.
Let me comment on that one. Sure. So we're gonna try and do a little bit of a. Gilbert's doing our play-by-play, and Chief and I are doing color commentary. First, I want to check. I think we have some reporters here who have been here through the whole process. Is that right? You two been here the whole time?
Not the whole time.
No. Okay. That's okay. Well, I'm glad you have some longitudinal perspective on this, and that's what I wanted to speak about here, because I think you see 3 distinct strategies here. And two of them were my responsibility, one was not. But what you see in the beginning is obviously beginning. And then you see low-hanging fruit in this neighborhood. And this was really the past mayoral administration. This was also, when we came in. And so you saw, all the easy things. I mean, I hate to say even easy, but the things that we were able to do without actually engaging our officers. So this is rewriting a lot of policies, and that's critical. That's important. But then you saw, and I remember I was warned about this. People said, "Oh, that's the easy part." It's really going to be hard when you actually have to retrain folks. And this is what you see in this era right here. And this is where we came in, and I remember saying explicitly initially, my first approach was to just say yes to the DOJ. So whenever there was an issue or a rub, I would say, let's do what they want us to do. And so this was sort of the fully lean in approach, as opposed to in the previous approach, there was a lot of like, let's do that later, or, I don't want to speak for the past administration, but I think some resistance to doing a lot of the reforms. So that was the first stage, was for us, was saying yes. And so that was, I break this into 3 stages. But what happened here, and we're going to talk about this, is things started to get really tough in this area. And we're going to talk about this era in more detail. But we made a big change here where we stopped just saying yes. This is what the chief is talking about. Instead of acquiescing to every single best practice from New Jersey or Portland or all of these communities, and instead of doing everything the monitor told us to do, we started pushing back. But we would push back with our own answer that best fits Albuquerque. That was the difference. So we started doing our own reform in our own way in this era right here. And that was by far and away the best decision that the chief and I have made in our collective team to get us actually to where we are today, was to basically say, look, we are going to obviously learn from best practices, and we are going to listen, and then we're going to adapt and modify those to our department. And that's what got us buy-in on the front line. That's the other important thing. Had we not done that, we would have still had all sorts of resistance for the right reasons. And some of you may remember this. There were issues around proportional discipline, and there was the burrito in the car, and like all of these things that we were able to work through because we were not just literally copying policies from other cities. And so that's what the sort of third phase was. We're going to do reform, but we're going to do it our way, on our terms.
So this is just another slide showing us at 100% compliance. This does illustrate, though, that there are some portions of the CASA that are still not in operational compliance. Those deal with the Civilian Police Oversight Authority and the Civilian Police Oversight Board. And if you look, one's dealing with misconduct investigations, the other one's with community engagement and oversight. So there's, I think, a total of maybe 10 paragraphs or just a small section left, and that's not under the control of APD. So everything that's under control of APD is 100%. CPOA and the board is under the city council, so hopefully they'll make progress, but that's the only place we're short at this point. This is just another slide showing that, but it shows the 9 sections of the CASA. So I think when we see a lot of news coverage and people thinking about reform and our agreement, they think it's just officer-involved shootings or just use of force. Use of force was the main thing that brought the DOJ here, but these are dealt with a lot of different things, including specialized units. I think they were one of the first ones to be in compliance. Crisis intervention is a huge one. It's one where I think we've surpassed all expectations, if I'm correct, in dealing with people in crisis. Policy and training, misconduct investigations, staffing, management, and supervision, recruitment, selection, and promotions, officer assistance support, and then community engagement and oversight. So a lot of that has to do with APD, but as I said, some of it has to do with civilian oversight. So we're trying to get that right and get that moved forward.
One of the things I think that's important to mention on this slide is as you look at this, you recognize that this consent decree wasn't just about officer-involved shootings and use of force. This consent decree in a lot of places and a lot of parts was about rebuilding the entire police department. Because if you look at everything here, it deals with everything from how we are recruiting, selecting, and promoting individuals within the police department. And we establish guidelines in that. We look at laterals background before they come over to APD and see what they can and can't do. We ensure that our investigations for misconduct are improved, fully investigated, and that we hit all the areas that we need to. But we also look at the other side, like how are we supporting our officers? How are we ensuring that their mental health is well, and how do we give them the resources and the help that they need? And community engagement and oversight. And we talked about the CPOA, they're working, they've done a tremendous job with the resources they have to get to where they're at. And I'm very confident they're going to continue to move forward. It also talks about community engagement. And I think that's one of the number one things that when I was here in 2014 prior to my retirement that I noticed is that we didn't do a good job of engaging with the entire community. We pick and choose who we wanted to be friends with, so to speak. We focused everything on neighborhood associations. My first 20 years, I could say 95% of the meetings I went to were dealing with neighborhood associations. We've grown that. We have an ambassador program, the motto, the ears for the voices never heard within the community. And we've built relationships that we've never had before within the community that we hope will continue and will flourish and continue to bring us the information and the knowledge of what's important to the community that we didn't have in the past.
And I'd ask our city attorney, Lauren Keefe, to come up and talk about this next slide, which deals with paragraph status. And as you know, the agreement's broken up into a number of paragraphs, and she can talk about where we're at right now.
Great, thank you, everybody. The agreement provides that once APD has been in compliance with a paragraph for 2 full years, that paragraph can then go into suspended monitoring. The monitoring team will no longer conduct reports on that paragraph, and APD will do self-assessment. And then after a 2-year period, those paragraphs can be dismissed from the agreement. Back about 2 years ago, we had started that process, but it had stalled, in particular during COVID, as many things did. But so 2 years ago, we reinitiated that process and reached an agreement for the first batch of paragraphs to go into self-assessment. Those paragraphs now have been dismissed. We've done two dismissals, one that's already been approved by the court, one that's currently pending in the court. And so 56% of the paragraphs in total have already been dismissed from the consent decree. There's another 19% that are in the suspended status, where it's APD who is conducting the evaluations and not the monitoring team. So what the monitoring team has left is the 25%. And this process will continue now, even though we're now in full and effective compliance. So with each IMR, there will be another series of paragraphs that go into self-assessment and another series of paragraphs that are eligible for dismissal as we move toward the end of this process. And we're going to continue to narrow it down to, now the monitor only has 25%. So that number is going to continue to reduce throughout this final stage of the consent decree.
Thank you, Lauren. And we'll just go kind of quickly through the timeline. Again, we started with 2014, and this is the first 4 years. So,
Could you just announce Lauren's title?
Yeah, Lauren Keefe is the city attorney for the city of Albuquerque. For 2014, and the mayor kind of went over some of this. So 2015, 2016, they started working on policy and different items. And as I said earlier, the specialized units were the first to reach compliance in 2017. So that was a short version of the first 4 years. 2018 is when Mayor Keller's administration came in, and that was a key to things. He talked a little bit about that, but one of the first things that was created was a compliance bureau. And I think it's important to note that there's been a lot of talk about us reaching full compliance and how is APD going to monitor itself. Well, that process actually started back in 2018 when this bureau was completed. So, we have been policing ourselves and monitoring ourselves to some extent and getting better at it, but the mayor could talk a little bit about his approach when he came in.
So this was our first year, and one of the things that we heard loud and clear on the campaign trail was that the department and the city was not prioritizing reform. And that was a reflection of a lot of things, but it was also a reflection that at the top, there was not someone of high rank who was in charge of reform. And also that reform was sort of living at kind of the lieutenant level, which is sort of the policy writing level. And so when we came in, we drastically changed that. We built the compliance bureau, and just to remember, at APD there are 5 bureaus, and so there used to only be 4. So we added one, and we consolidated everything under a deputy chief. So there was a clear person in charge who was of very high rank, who was accountable for working with the DOJ and working on reform. So in that version, it was actually now Superintendent Garcia, but he was the first deputy chief of compliance, and that was an action we took, I think, around January or February, just 2 months into office, so that we could consolidate and hold ourselves accountable from a leadership perspective where we were going on reform.
So I'll turn this one over to Chief Medina. 2019, when Chief Medina was deputy chief, one of the innovative things he created was a scorecards system, and it lives on today.
You know, in 2019, I was deputy chief of field services, and we're trying to come into compliance with the area commands. And I distinctly remember the commanders had no idea if they were passing, failing. There was no way for me to know unless I went specifically to ask and dig up information. And when I was lieutenant in 2010 and 11, in property crimes, we had a lot of success. But I walked around with a sheet, and I could tell you every number for every area command. I knew that if I was above 55 auto thefts for a week, I was asking questions. So what we started to do is we started to track compliance in the same format, and we created scorecards. And the very first edition of scorecards came in, and they were all pink or red, pinkish red, and that signified that the commander was not in compliance. And it was a jaw-dropping meeting between myself and the commanders when I said, what is going on? You've met no benchmarks. And it had all the benchmarks, 2 videos reviewed, where their sergeants doing their jobs. The next month they came in and they had a little bit of yellow and some green. By the 3rd, 4th month, they were slowly turning all green. And it took us some time, and now today we still will continue to utilize those scorecards to ensure that officers are conducting what they have to do. Basically all we did, and with something else we'll talk about later, is we took a very successful program that NYPD used, CompStats, which holds people accountable to statistics. And we created that version for compliance.
And then in 2020 is where the mayor talked about, and we've talked about it previously, this is the backslide, where it started. It dipped from really 64%, then to 62%, and then down to 59%. There are a lot of reasons for that. Obviously, COVID started that year. We started seeing crime go up towards the end of the year. We had protests that entire year. It was a rough year for a lot of people. But we were also not able to sustain the operational compliance, so that started to backslide. And on that, as we talked about some of the reasons, here's the chart I showed earlier was the operational compliance. This is just broken up into which chief was overseeing the department at which time. You want to talk about that?
Yeah. So, yeah, my notes here. There's a couple of things about this neighborhood, the yellow era. Gilbert mentioned some basic context, but I mentioned this a few times, and I think during COVID it was a little bit lost on folks. We were basically put on informal notice that our department was sliding off into a chasm, and that receivership was possible. And you may remember there was some of this that was publicly reported, advocates who were asking for it. And receivership is, of course, the ultimate, I think, failure of leadership. This was the point when we knew we had to do things differently, because our department was literally on the cusp of completely going off the abyss and being taken over literally by a custodian. We would essentially lose the Albuquerque Police Department. That was on the table in this era. And this is one of the reasons, as we've discussed before, why we felt there was a need for a new chief of police. This was also one of the reasons why we felt like we had to make much bigger changes to be able to actually conduct reform on our own terms. Because during COVID, this is where the rub between just copying best practices and also having Zoom meetings with the monitor was also just not working. This was also the era where we saw lots of officers retiring. This is the era where we saw our rank and file almost ready to give up on the leadership at APD and at the city of Albuquerque. That's how bad 2020 was. And I think you all remember what that looked like both on the streets, but also with COVID in our homes and at our department. And that's why we made some major changes after that, including the biggest thing was that directional change. That is, we are going to do reform, but we are going to do it our way. That's when that decision was made.
And I just want to add to that wouldn't have been possible without the support of the administration, the mayor, and everybody else that allowed it. When we pushed back on the Department of Justice, it took certain personalities to be able to confront, push back, and tell individuals that I don't think you're right. And that is the biggest trait that I wanted to instill in my deputy chiefs and make sure that they knew that it was okay to push back and say no. And we couldn't have accomplished that if we didn't have the support from the mayor and everybody else at the top of city government, because it was very contagious when we were in court with individuals that we're pushing back on. And it wasn't appreciated or liked at first, and there are very many heated conversations during this time in these federal court hearings between myself, some of my leadership, and members of the monitoring team. But I think it really put a reset to the process and got us to a point where we're able to work in collaboration with one another, and we're able to problem solve through issues, and our voice was heard as a department as to what was wrong. I couldn't have officers for 5 hours on a forced handcuffing. That was my biggest argument. Couldn't have officers just sitting around waiting for a use of force when calls were stacking and the community wanted an officer to go help them in a specific call. So I just want to thank everybody who supported us in the pushback and allowed us to do the job that we needed to do to get us to that point where we had respect for our relationships between all the parties, and we were able to problem solve and listen to one another.
So I think the mayor said this, but also part of that transition went from Chief Medina coming in as the superintendent of police reform. The actual position was created at that time. Another important thing is the Albuquerque Community Safety was created at this time. It was a concept, I think, in 2020, started to go operational in 2021, and was a huge addition. As you may recall, there was a lot of anti-police sentiment around the country, and meanwhile, the mayor pushed forward on this concept to treat some of the calls without law enforcement, and that's how ACS was born. Do you want to say more about that?
Yeah. So if we take us back to that era, we're coming out of COVID, at least we thought we were, and then it sort of came back a little bit. But we're coming out of COVID, and it was abundantly clear to myself and our team over at City Hall that we had to make some massive changes to prevent our department from sliding into receivership and losing the support of the rank and file officers. So basically we did the following things. Number one, we picked a new chief who had some new ideas about how to do this. That was, of course, Harold Medina. Number two, we decided that we were actually going to hire something called EFIT to help us deal with the backlog and the processing of cases. Because that was going so slow, even the victims of use of force found no justice, solace, or faith in our department because nothing was being processed and these backlogs were just growing. The next thing we did was we committed to creating a third department in our emergency response system so that we could have responses to low-level health, mental health, behavioral health calls, and essentially just in-need calls handled by social workers. And I think everyone here is aware of the Albuquerque Community Safety Department, which is now up and running 24/7. It's taken last year 40,000 calls that APD and our fire department did not have to take. But all these ideas were part of a package to save our department, and in many ways our city at the time, from falling sort of off that abyss. The last thing that we did is we said we actually have to have, instead of just a compliance bureau, which at the time reported to the chief of police, because of the transition of Chief Medina and I talked about this, and he said, the only way to actually have some faith in this system is to make sure that we have a final stop for discipline, to hold our officers and our department accountable that is not accountable to the chief. This is what the advocates had been asking for decades. This was one of the most forward-looking approaches that had been used in other cities. And so we looked around and we were able to put together the Office of the Superintendent of Reform, which of course has a superintendent. It's now Eric Garcia. And that superintendent has the say over discipline and does not report to the chief of police. This was a big change, number one, in giving faith in the community and in victims, that there was at least going to be some sort of different opinion other than a chief of police. And the second thing was, it set the stage for our officers too to recognize that we were staffing this department with people who knew our community and knew what they were doing. They were not just enforcing, rote legislation from New Jersey or from Portland. And so this is when you saw these longstanding issues, if you were in the details, around proportional discipline and progressive discipline. This is when we fixed all that. That was really grinding the officers down because we were able to say, no, here's what works in our city. And also, but we're not going to have everything be the chief's decision. And I want to acknowledge the chief. It is a rare chief of police who will agree that for the good of the city and the good of reform, that he should not be in charge of discipline. And so those were the changes that we made in this era, which led us to the next year, 2022.
In 2019, as a deputy chief, I talked about earlier about when I was a commander in property crimes, I walked around with numbers. I believed that we needed to keep track, and everybody should be accountable for their area commander, for their section. Is auto theft going down? If not, why? Auto theft sergeant's going to answer for it. And one of the names that we haven't mentioned today, she recently retired. She did a wonderful job. We had developed a program called Duke City Stats, which was modeled after CompStats in NYPD, where commanders came in every couple weeks and they were questioned. What is the biggest crime problem in your area? And we put them on the hot seat. We made them accountable for lowering crime within their area command. And I think it's helped us to get to where we are today with some of the property crime rates at the level that they're at. Corey Lowe, who was now the deputy chief of compliance, saw the concept of Duke City Stat, and she had a wonderful idea. She created Reform Stat, which basically held individuals who were responsible for paragraphs, responsible for those paragraphs going into compliance. And she'd make them present every Friday. They'd come back, and Jason is nodding his head because he had several of those paragraphs, and she held them accountable to their benchmarks. They had timelines, they had time frames, and she wanted to make sure that they met deadlines. And they'd give me lists, and I'd be all, did they meet their deadline? And it was all about creating a culture of accountability. And I think that's the biggest thing that we need to get out of this at the end of the day, is that this is about accountability, whether it's accountability for crime or it's accountability for compliance. Leadership must always be willing to hold those that are other leaders and responsible for certain areas responsible for getting the work done that needs to be done. And Corey did a great job in implementing Reform Stat in the compliance world.
So now we're moving into this last couple of years, and this is where a lot of the things started to pick up. So in 2023, the city attorney talked about dismissal of paragraphs. So this was the first partial dismissal of paragraphs, 59 back in 2023. At the same time, or around that time, 55 paragraphs moved to self-assessment. That's where our bureau started self-assessing. And then another key decision that the mayor made was creating voluntary internal monitors. So we have the independent monitoring team under the court that's been overseeing this whole process. I think we started to see where that was going to phase out, and we created our own internal monitors from the city level that was essentially outside of APD. So we have a police training monitor, a monitor for discipline and misconduct, and a monitor for use of force. In addition to that, we started reaching other benchmarks. This was a huge one, use of force, which is the biggest issue in the CASA. The number of use of force incidents were within policy 95% of the time. So if you think about it, I think use of force is just a fraction of all contact that officers make with the public. Within that contact, there may be a use of force incident a percentage of the time. And 95% of the time it was within policy. So that's important to talk about. Not use of force didn't just go down, but it was within policy, which was our overall goal. And then another benchmark is the Internal Affairs Force Division assumed full control over the current use of force investigations. So we talked about EFIT, the external group that was in here. At this point in late 2023, IAFD took back control over that. That meant that EFIT and the monitors felt like they had they were doing a good job in training investigators and actually investigating uses of force.
Let me just add one thing. So our voluntary creation of the internal monitors, this was really designed to show again and again that we were going above and beyond what was needed at the current time and setting the stage for us to not have the CASA and to get out of this and to be in full compliance. And so part of that was saying that we have our own team. Two of them are local, they're former judges. One of them is an expert from out of state, which is a good combo. That we have folks who can actually also be independent monitors. We don't need a court-ordered monitor. And so that's why that was set up.
So come to this year, 2024. So I talked about use of force policy being within 95% of the time. Now it's within 97% of the time. So it continues to improve. Additional 33 paragraphs moved into self-assessment. The other part that EFIT did with force investigations is we had hit that point where the mayor talked about earlier, and we had 678 backlog cases. So what that meant is they had missed deadlines, and discipline could no longer be placed on officers who violated policy. But the monitors and the DOJ still wanted those cases investigated. And so EFIT took on that role, and they just recently completed those that backlog of cases. Obviously, this week we reached 100% operational compliance, which we've spoken about, and what that means is full and effective compliance, which this will go to the court. We'll have a court hearing in June that will talk a lot about this stuff. Final thing, 93 additional paragraphs are pending dismissal. A joint motion was filed in court this week to dismiss those paragraphs.
Gilbert, just one thing on that slide, the 678 backlog. This mattered for victims. So not in every case, but in a lot of this case, right, there's somebody on the other side of that use of force. And they were the ones who...
Would you mind going to the podium?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I was trying to make a short point, and then it turned out to be longer. Okay, the 678 use of force cases. Remember what's on the other side of that. Roughly, there are 678 people who care about what happened to them in terms of use of force. And I heard about this all the time from victims, and they would say a range of things, but often they would say, we just want the internal affairs investigation to be completed because they were all so late. And so they just wanted some sort of justice or discipline or not. They wanted an answer. And when we finally cleared this backlog, we were at least able to offer an answer. Whereas historically, we had no answer for any of these cases. And so that was very important for sort of reconciliation with the community and with victims.
You know, and one thing I'll add on before Gilbert goes on to the next is, here we are, 2024, and what does this all mean to where we're at right now? And you know, I think the most important thing is that we look at that the path we've chose to go forward has been not a single path about compliance. It's been about building a police department that is effective and works well within the community. 2023, as I think the editorial board stated, was one of our greatest years in decades. And I'm going to highlight some of the things that are important to that. We basically hit 100% compliance in 2023 because this monitoring period ended January 31st. We had a 13% reduction in homicide. Our clearance rate went from the 50s when I took over to a 94, 95% clearance rate for homicides. 23,000 traffic tickets to almost 90,000 traffic tickets last year. Our warrants, felony warrants cleared, were up double digits last year, along with auto theft being down double digits. But arrests were up, and they were back to the level they were prior to the pandemic. So I think it's important that we take and we look at this as a whole, and we recognize this project hasn't just been about going into compliance and having a police department that practices constitutional policing by depolicing and not doing their job. This is about making sure that we had a process and a police department that was highly effective in the community, did great work, and did it in a constitutional manner. And I think that's the most important thing we recognize is that the vision myself, Mayor had, It wasn't just about being in compliance. It was about being a very good, strong, law enforcement committed department that got things done in a constitutional manner.
I also wanted to point out the 678 backlog cases, I believe it was less than 5% were within policy. That sound right, Jason?
Outside.
We're outside of policy. Yeah, 5% were outside of policy. The rest were in policy. And then I mentioned earlier officer-involved shootings, and there's a perception that that's the only thing that's been the focus of this CASA agreement, which is not true. But I do want to say, and a lot of people have brought up, and a lot of critics especially, the increase in number of shootings in 2022 in particular. In court in January, the DOJ made this statement: we engaged multiple experts with law enforcement experience, and we concluded that we don't see a continuation of the pattern and practice of unconstitutional uses of force within these OIS events. So they looked at all the OIS incidents in 2022 and for the first half of 2023. So they brought in outside experts and looked at it themselves and made these comments during the court hearing in January, which is key to what we're trying to get at.
So often when we talk about this issue, folks say, well, you know, the number of shootings has increased, or it hasn't. It depends on the year. And we understand that. We also know that that is most correlated to crime in general, right? So we wanted to have reform, and we all want to have less shootings. But that's not actually what the CASA is about. That's not actually what reform is about. Reform is about whether or not it was constitutional use of force. And that's what this quote speaks to. That is the measure of reform, not the volume of shootings. And that's also because in the actions of officers each and every day, right, their engagements, it's also about, is a department able to accurately assess if it was a constitutional use of force, which is what we've spoken to on the last slide, and when it is not, if the department is appropriately handling those officers with respect to discipline and accountability. That's what the CASA is about, right? It's about a department being able to both train and use, when necessary, constitutional force, and when it is not constitutional, hold themselves accountable and hold those officers accountable. That's what this is speaking to, and that is what the reform process is literally all about by definition.
And I should say too that the other big factor, I think, looking back at the 2014 report that I reread, was the number of incidents that didn't involve a weapon or the person wasn't likely to injure someone. I think we've seen in the last few years, it's not on the slide here, but the number of individuals who have been highly intoxicated or on meth or other types of drugs, but also armed with a handgun or some sort of weapon. We saw it again last night, unfortunately, another one of those. And I think Chief could talk about this, but also officers who actually shot in the line of duty in some of these incidents. So we've been very fortunate that officers have escaped these, in some cases with serious injuries, but that's what they're facing. So we got to remember that part of it. But aside from officers involved shootings, there is a whole different levels of force, and this is the real basis of what we do with use of force investigations. So just real quickly, level 1 is, you could read it there, just the lowest level that's investigated, and I think we've gone through a lot of different processes to more efficiently investigate these in the field. And I think when I had the slide up there about ingenuity, I think that's what the monitors were talking about, because we used our own pilot program to more efficiently investigate these and make sure that officers weren't tied up during those investigations. And I'll be able to respond to calls. Level 2 are more serious. They could cause injury, could reasonably be expected to cause injury, or results in a complaint of injury. So those are a separate type, and I think what investigators have progressed on is they've able to more accurately distinguish between those different levels and investigate them as such. Level 3 are the most serious, like an officer-involved shooting or use of a taser. And that could reasonably result in serious physical injury, hospitalization, or death. But I think in this most recent monitors report, level 2 and level 3 uses of force are down maybe 16% or so. So that's pretty significant. And we put this out previously, but the chief mentioned that arrests had gone down around COVID, and they've now gone back up in 2023, and they're back about the same level. At the same time, overall use of force cases have gone down pretty significantly.
Couple of things on that one,
Okay.
One is, I want to mention that there was a challenge when we look at this graph right here. In this world during COVID, the training, and this was one of the things that unfortunately with the past chief that was not helpful, is they stopped the use of force training during COVID. And this was actually something that the administration was not aware that it was happening. And I understand like it was COVID, but other departments were still doing training, right? There's virtual, there's all sorts of other things. So what we did right away in the end of 2022, sort of in the early fall, is we rapidly accelerated the training aspect. And to us, that's why you saw the training was taking place literally as this line goes down. That is, you can almost clock that exactly to the number of officers that were trained in the new use of force policies.
And this is the last slide, and this is basically the image of the scorecard explained a little bit. And the other part of this, we recently, I think everything's online now with these scorecards. So not only is there accountability within department, you could go on to, we have a whole section on the settlement agreement, all of the investigations, the reports, but you could also find scorecards and see how different areas of the department is performing and or not performing. But that's the same thing we're doing internally. So with that, we're open to any questions.
I have one question. Jason, whose scorecard is that? They got red on.
So before we take some questions, I want to mention a couple of closing thoughts. Number one, we know that at the end of the day, when this happened, right, Albuquerque in the last 2 decades was unfortunately a poster child for the need for reform. This was actually before George Floyd and that sort of summer of social justice and turbulence. We had these challenges before, and I remember talking to other mayors at the time saying like, yeah, these are real issues. That's why our city's under a consent decree. So number one is that was sort of what we were held up as in 2020 by folks who wanted reform. It's like, look, this is already happening in Albuquerque, et cetera, and Albuquerque has all these problems. Now you see today the exact opposite example, which is that we are an example of reform. These reform efforts have taken like 40 years in LA, I forget how long in Seattle. They're in different places around the country, Baltimore. And I'm not saying that we knocked the cover off the ball here, but we are rounding the bases and coming into home. And because of that, we now gather as the Conference of Mayors with mayors from all around the country. And my role has actually shifted on those calls from explaining about the need for reform and what reform is to actually how to move through it. And it's a reflection of everything that you just saw here today. And from an American perspective, I think it's very important to know that Albuquerque's had that shift where now we're looked to how to actually get things done instead of being looked at as an example of a problem. And so there are, new cities in this world, whether it's Phoenix or Minneapolis or Louisville, right? And they are now looking to Albuquerque in terms of how to set this up and how to work with the monitor and how to work for the DOJ. So I think from an American perspective, Albuquerque has also turned a page. And we're now in a place where we can be something that's part of what is good about the future of America and public safety instead of historically what was the opposite. Lastly, part of our success has been about going above and beyond what the CASA called for. The CASA did not call for the Office of Superintendent of Reform, but we did it because we felt it was needed for our city in our community. That doesn't mean it would work anywhere else, but that was our own decision. We did the internal monitors for the same reason, so that we could say we are going to do this with or without the CASA, and here's the people who are going to do it. And also creating that third response department. No other city in America has an alternative response that is 24/7, cabinet level, staffed with social workers taking 911 calls. And so ACS has been the third example of us going above and beyond. And I think it is what has really underpinned confidence, because we know we're going to make mistakes. When you have to deal with the criminal elements on our streets, and when you have to use of force, we know that mistakes will happen. The mark of success is that we hopefully make those mistakes as few or as little as times as possible. And when we do, they're appropriately assessed and the individual is held accountable as well as the department. That is where we're now at today. Thank you.
You know, this has been a long journey. In April of 2014, I sat in my substation in the Southwest Area Command and I watched the news conference that occurred as they made the announcement. And I still remember the distinct words that the Albuquerque Police Department is involved in a pattern of practice in the use of unconstitutional force. Later that afternoon, myself, Deputy Chief Garcia, were all summoned to this exact room, and they told us a little bit more about what this process was, what it meant. And to be honest, Commander Harold Medina was a little bit at odds with what was said. I didn't completely believe we were that bad. But this is how this process changes you. 2024, Chief Harold Medina tells me the best thing that ever happened to the Albuquerque Police Department was this settlement agreement. It changed us, it made us better, and we are a much better police department because of it. And that is the most important thing that we recognize now. We needed change, and it's important.
You have any questions?
There was talk before about the CPOA part being broken out so that APD could go forward with the 2-year period. Is there a reason? Is that happening? Is there a reason?
Lauren's going to answer that.
So thank you for the question. It's not happening right now. Where we are really is that, again, this starts a 2-year clock. We're not quite sure when that clock begins. We're having discussions with DOJ until we can fully terminate. And DOJ has agreed that we can decide later see where CPOA is and CPOA-B and determine whether that step is even necessary. They have 10 paragraphs right now that are out of compliance. We're hoping that in the next IMRs that CPOA continues to progress and go into compliance. And so we'll evaluate at that point whether a separate agreement would be necessary.
Okay, and to clarify, the clock, it will start, like you're trying to agree to see if you can start it prior to now, but basically DOJ has agreed that the latest would be like it started now.
There's been no agreement, just to be clear, on when the clock would start. Our position is it does start at the beginning of IMR 19, which is August 1st, 2023. But we're in discussions with DOJ, and some of those discussions will probably happen around the hearing on June 4th. Yes.
Following up on the CPOA part, what is the city doing to support the CPOA to get it into compliance?
So in the current budget that was approved last night by council, although not, or by committee, we've added 3 new investigators to CPOA. In the last budget cycle, we added 2. We added 1 through the budget, and then we transferred 1 position into CPOA. We've added 3 new positions and also additional operation funds. And so we're hoping that with additional investigators, they will be able to meet their timeliness goals, which they're not doing right now, and to increase their thoroughness, which is a concern of the monitors.
I thought I saw in the, sorry.
Yeah, so I do want to just be clear though, the city changed the ordinance about the CPOA. So as a matter of independence, the administration has no control over them. So there's a pro and a con to that. They are definitely independent, but we also can't do anything else for them, like literally. And so they have to do it for themselves, just like we had to do all our reform for ourselves.
I thought I saw in the most recent report though that there was some concerns about the CPOA not getting timely materials regarding OISs and show of force investigations. Is that something that, I know they're independent, but like that obviously depends on the police department.
They are independent. There are obligations on APD to provide information to them. We have been working with them. This has been sort of an ongoing issue where we are trying to provide materials to them, and there are often disputes between the 2 agencies, really. So I would say we do everything we can to get them information as timely as possible.
You know, one thing I want to say about the timelines, I don't want to get stuck on timelines, and I want us to think of a track. And you know, if you're on a track and you're racing, that in a round track, the starting point isn't always in the same spot. The finish line is in the same spot, but the starting point isn't in the same line because some lanes are longer than others. And think of the timelines as that. There are some paragraphs that went into compliance way early, and their 2-year mark's coming up. And if you think back and you start thinking of the monitoring periods, like this last monitoring period, we're only short, before this, we're only short 3 paragraphs. So not only is it important for us to recognize that because we're in 100% compliance, but it's also important to recognize that it's going to be a staggered approach to paragraphs being dismissed. You already saw that 24% or 19% are in self-assessment right now. That will be the next batch that goes towards the courts to be dismissed way before the 2-year mark from now. So once those are proven to go into self-assessment, which could be the next monitoring period that they hit a certain time frame, those could be dismissed, and that potentially leave us at 75% dismissed. So it's not going to be, there's not going to be this big finale of everything's dismissed at the end because of the approach of the 2-year mark. So the big finale is going to be the final paragraphs are dismissed at the end.
Question for Chief Medina and Mayor Keller. Do you have concerns about just the sheer number of errors that have managed to not only be present in drafts of independent monitor reports, but find their way into publication? Many of them have made the department, they've severely inflated use of force numbers over the years.
We get a draft report, and I think this goes back to a little bit of what Mayor talked about. I think that there was a time frame we just said, we're not going to fight back, we're not going to push. I think that right now, we've went through the report, this last report, and anything we found in error, we calculated and corrected.
Many of those have made their way into publication though.
Yeah, I'm not-
77 OIS in 2018 is a gross overcount of what this department logged.
I think it was more of a typo than
Yeah.
it
Right.
was
But-
never
But we do,
presented that way.
we do try to correct those typos to some extent when we get the draft, and we will highlight them for Dr. Ginger. And I agree that sometimes sometimes he makes those corrections. In fact, I think he does his best to make them, but he doesn't always. So that was probably just an oversight. But to Chief Medina's point, we started really evaluating where we were 2 years ago in terms of, for the paragraphs that were out of compliance. Are we out of compliance, because APD isn't doing what it's doing, or because there are some issues with the monitoring process? We had multiple meetings with DOJ and with the monitor to make sure that the monitoring process was what it was supposed to be when it was agreed upon in 2015, and that they were applying the correct standard. And so we had multiple conversations and have pointed out when they weren't following their own methodology, and pointed out when APD was in fact in compliance and they weren't giving us credit for being in compliance. And the monitor very often has been receptive to that feedback and has made those corrections.
Sure, but it seems that just as often those errors find their way into the final reports, and I struggle to see how that's not a cause for concern.
And I'd have to see like how far back this goes. I'm concentrated on IMR 19. IMR 19 brings us to 100% compliance. We went thoroughly through IMR 19. I'm comfortable with the data within IMR 19, and depending on when these reports came out, I think that's why Mayor made changes. Like I said it earlier, it takes certain personality to push back on individuals, and the personality of a chief that pushes back was what was needed. And if there was an error in 2018, I wish that previously somebody else holding my position would have corrected that error.
Thanks.
Yes, Nick.
When will the Dr. Ginger pass off go to the internal monitoring team where Dr. Ginger's not overseeing this?
I think I think that also goes in stages. There's there's some paragraphs that have already been dismissed, and I was talking to Commander Sanchez earlier about, our process we're continuing to self-evaluate. So it's a work in action as we continue to go forward. They're assuming a bigger and bigger role. As paragraphs are dismissed, they're assuming a bigger role. We're already sending use of force cases to our expert, Chris Darcy, that's reviewing them at the same time as the DOJ is. So I don't think it shouldn't be either an exact, today DOJ ends, our monitors start tomorrow. We're kind of running together at the same time and hopefully learning from each other.
I just want to add though, the judge decides that. Remember, we are not in charge of the monitor, as he has let us know on numerous occasions. So it's ultimately up to a judge, but we think we're ready.
And just to follow up with the team, is it going to be a similar monetary investment as Dr. Ginger?
Oh no, I think the team, we've already released that information. They could get it for you later. It's much reduced cost than we're going through right now.
Will it be on the website?
We've already released information on what we pay the internal monitors.
Yeah.
We'll get it. It's already been released several times. I think if somebody here has it, send it to Nick. Yes.
So obviously obviously the initial findings letter brought up a lot that when officers used unconstitutional force, they were not being, those investigations weren't thorough, they weren't being disciplined for it, the investigations were often letting them off the hook for something that should have been found unconstitutional. What specific systems are now in place because of the CASA to make sure that investigations are up to standard, in your point of view?
You know, in my point of view, the number one thing, and I'm gonna let actually Eric talk about this, because that's his area. But the number one thing I think that Eric's team did is they reduced the number of discipline authorities and people who have the final say-so on reviewing an investigation and how they feel the findings were, whether they legit and they support the detective's findings or not. But I think, Eric, I'd like you to jump in here just because I have the Reader's Digest version, and Eric may have more detail or know something better.
No, the chief is right. We reduced our disciplinary authorities from over 20 to 4. So the discipline was consistent and impartial throughout the department. As far as the investigations go, the chief put one of his strongest commanders in Internal Affairs Force Division, who's Commander Norris. And he's held the detectives to a very high standard. EFIT has also helped us do the investigations with the new investigative process. So all those areas have helped us be where we are today.
You know, Lisa, and one thing I want to add to that, though, is, you know, and this is where we kind of were at odds with the DOJ early on and the monitor, is they felt our officers were on purpose not coming to the findings needed. I looked at our homicide clearance rate at 50, and I knew we had an investigative problem with the department. And I knew there was something wrong, that we weren't training our people right to do what they needed to. And we developed the Detective Academy, and there's a lot of, all our detectives have gone. We've seen the benefits of that. But with EFIT, we kind of took that model and moved it over to Internal Affairs. And EFIT's biggest role in working with them was they were teachers and mentors and overseeing and helping them develop and learn and make sure that our detectives there met certain phases before they released them to do cases on their own. So I think one of the biggest things we've done is we've built a process to train and make sure that our detectives know what a good case looks like. Because quite honestly, I think every single person who went to Internal Force would tell you that they weren't trying to fight the process and not find officers accountable. They didn't know what success looked like. And we've brought people in to teach them what success looks like, and they're being able to recreate that in case after case.
What about cases then where EFIT disagreed, like the Jesus Basby case? You know, where the EFIT thought there was out of policy and the Force Review Board and IAFD said it was. So which do we trust?
That went through the process, obviously, with EFIT and through our investigative process. Our investigators came to the same conclusion that EFIT did. When it went through a command review, that's when it was overturned to be in policy. Now, we've learned a lot of lessons from that case. One was we've changed our use of force policy, thanks to the chief, where it allowed officers to utilize less lethal force much sooner in an encounter. That has helped that situation as well. We've also improved how we review the process in Internal Affairs, in the Force Division itself. Commander Norris and I have had many conversations over this, and we've had another layer of review. So the major that works in Internal Affairs Force also reviews those cases in addition to the final review by Commander Norris.
And I think we got to remember that since Jesus Crosby till now, there's been several monitoring periods, and Force has actually gone into compliance since that time frame. And Jason could check for us and get back to Elise later, but I don't believe we were in full compliance in Force Worry Scott investigations back at this time. And we've made changes, and since then we've gone into compliance. So it's very difficult because we can't be judged with where we are today on how we had outcomes in the past, because it's been evolving that we go into compliance and we get better. So I'm very confident where we are today. And if I went back specifically and looked at that time frame, I don't know if I would say we had worked out all the processes that we had to work out. And I think Superintendent Garcia really explained some of the changes that they made from learning in that process. And there's always going to be disagreement, and there's always going to be times that not everybody agrees. I mean, it's just humanly impossible. I could put $1 million right here and tell you could have it all when you agree on form of payment, and I guarantee you it'll still be here in 6 months because nobody's going to agree. It's that simple. So we need to just remember that part of what we've learned from Dr. Ginger is that we should always be evolving, we should always be changing, and we should always see how we could improve. And even now, as I look back in some of our most recent incidents, we're meeting every requirement of DOJ, but I think we could do better, and we find different ways, and we talk about how we could improve. The 6-month shooting reviews are another prime example. That's not a DOJ recommendation. I guarantee you other consent decrees are gonna start seeing that in there, but we found a new way above it to start reviewing to improve ourselves each and every time.
Let me just share something. I think what's interesting in this case is what would have happened before the consent decree. There would have been no video footage. There would have been review by, maybe a sergeant or something like that. Really no additional review. There would have been no public, you wouldn't even have known about it. And there was no independent review. And there was no learning. There was no correction of policy. There was no reason to do any of that. These things were just routinely passed off as part of policing. All of that has changed now. So while the outcome may be something that, we didn't do everything right and we have to make changes going forward, that wasn't even possible before CASA. And I think that was the whole point of the pattern of practice. Now we stop the pattern. There may still be an issue, but we adjust the pattern in the right direction. And, what was it, 12 years ago? I mean, none of this would have even been known, nor would have been talked about, and there would have been no policy corrections and no individual accountability.
Yes, but in the end, the officers still weren't found out of policy, right? You said that the command made it in the policy.
You know what?
So
This-
yes, we looked at a whole bunch.
Lisa, the city attorney, because we're still under litigation with this, just asked me not to comment on this anymore.
Okay.
No, I mean,
Well,
we
can I
just
ask
can't
one-
get into the details on one specific case. This is this press conference about the CASA, and we're not gonna resolve everything about Jesus Crosby here. But I will say also that the monitor itself is clear. A disagreement over the result does not mean the process is working. In fact, what we have to do is follow the process and follow the steps. And the monitor has said in the past, sometimes we don't agree with APD's conclusion. That doesn't mean that but APD is following the process. APD is doing what it's supposed to do. And I think there's just a fundamental disagreement. We made some decisions that we stand by, but we don't want to get into the details on that Crosby shooting.
Sure, can I ask a more general question then?
Yes.
So since that was not that long ago, how do we know that things have been cemented enough in place with the new changes to make sure that, a year from now, 3 years from now, we have a new mayor, we have a new chief, things don't go?
I think we've set up a process. We talked about internal monitors. We've talked about a culture. We talked about policy. I think there's an expectation also. I think this doesn't just lay on the current administration to make sure that the Albuquerque Police Department goes forward. I recently met with another media station, and we talked about the changes that have occurred within the police department. I remember coming back to APD in 2018, and an officer-involved shooting occurred, and you guys sat out there for hours wondering if there was an officer-involved shooting, because you had heard there was, but we never verified it. We've changed that. We're very transparent. We announce it as soon as we know it was an officer-involved shooting, and we no longer do that. We've now set an expectation for the community. And you know what? Without a doubt, yes, someday there'll be a different mayor, or there'll be a different chief, and I hope the community remembers that the expectation and the standard that we set at this point in time for what the community should receive in these situations and the type of information. We release now if there's a firearm. We have full briefings. And yes, we want all these processes to go forward. We have all these monitors. But if anybody ever comes and threatens the process that we've created, I would hope that there are members in the community that says, stop. We don't want to go back down that road. So this isn't just a responsibility of the Albuquerque Police Department, because I can't guarantee you that everything we do now will be here forever. The people of Albuquerque have to know what good looked like, what success looked like, and they have to demand it from this point forward from their police department.
Any other questions?
Just quick, what was his first, last name and title?
Eric Garcia, Superintendent of Police Reform.
All right.
Okay, thank you, everybody.